So we are doing a series of studies and experiments on how people perceive the trade-off between cost and benefit, which means how they subjectively evaluate these two dimensions. As you know for sure, um, people usually are asked to sacrifice some of their resources to help others. Most of the times could be money, or they can um, give objects that they own, or their time, of course. And so it's very likely that they are trying to balance how much they are giving with the impact or the benefit that they can produce for the recipients of these helping action, their helping action. So what we study is basically the perception of the cost for the donor, the amount of resource that they must give up to help. Also considering the opportunity cost, so the alternative use they can do or with the same resource, and how they balance this with the perceived benefit for the recipient. So how much good they can do with their action and decision. And of course, giving doesn't depend on cost and benefit only. There are several different motivations that people can have to help, and among them there are feelings. People can feel for a specific cause, for example, for refugees, or climate change, or some kind of disease that their relatives happen to suffer from, or things like this. And they can experience feelings toward the people in need, people with disabilities, or other groups that are in need of help. In addition, donors are more and more likely to assess the impact or the effectiveness of a specific charity. There is, of course, a lot of competition between among different charities, and people try as much as they can to find the best charity, the most effective one. Again, we are always kind of making a distinction here between the actual effectiveness, the actual impact of a charity, and the perceived one. So how people, actually the donors, perceive this effectiveness. And of course, there are many other reasons that move people to give or refrain them to help. And the idea is that all these motivations, all these factors end up creating this perception of cost and benefit. So, and of course, people don't assess cost and benefit just in a vacuum, but they perceive them based on the information they receive when they are making a decision. And we know from research that people don't have necessarily strong preferences, but they make up their preferences on the fly in the time that they are making the decision. So the information we give them can have tremendous impact on what they end up doing. And so the idea is that the perceived perception of cost and benefit is kind of malleable and flexible, and we can influence it in order to maximize the chance that people will help. And I want to show you a little example of what I mean, and then I will present a couple of experiments we have run. One in which we increased the perceived benefit of a donation appeal, and another one in which we reduced the cost of the donation, the perceived cost, not the actual cost. So if you look at this table, here you have different donation amounts and different number of lives that can be helped in this experiment. these were children. And for all the scenarios from 1 to 7, you have that one life is worth a $2.5 donation. People were presented with all these scenarios, so everybody saw all the scenarios in a random order. And as you may expect, what we found is that going from scenario 1 to scenario 7, regardless from the randomized or presentation order, donation went down. So as you can see from here, when it's a $5 donation, you have 2 children. A lot of people say, yeah, of course, I'm going to help. But when it's a $225 donation, you can help a lot more people. There is not a lot of people who are willing to help. And of course, $225 might be quite a large amount, but already at 50, scenario 4, we are under 50% of people who are willing to give. And what we have found measuring the perceived cost and benefit is that going from scenario 1 to scenario 7, the benefit of helping goes up. So helping 90 children feels better and more beneficial than helping 2 children. But what really changes is the cost. And so the trade-off that is very favorable in the first scenario, tremendous, very good benefit of helping and not a lot of cost for the donor, perceived cost for the donor, becomes smaller and smaller as the 2 dimensions increase, keeping the ratio, the number of life helped per dollar constant. And in the end, the cost becomes even higher than the benefit. And at that point, most people don't give. So how can we influence this trade-off and help more people give, and so have a better response from the donors? One way to do this is a very famous effect in decision making, which is the attraction effect. So the attraction effect is a pretty simple, actually, way to present alternatives to people, and it's very popular in consumer behavior. So imagine that you ask people to choose between a $600 stay for 3 days in a 4-star hotel in Rome, or a $600 stay for 3 days in a 4-star hotel in Rome with breakfast. Of course, the second alternative is better than the first one. Okay, it's the same amount of money, but I get the breakfast in the second case, and I don't get it in the first one. So everybody would choose the second one. In the charitable giving context, we apply this use of dominated alternatives in a way to boost the benefit of a donation appeal, and so increase the difference between perceived benefit and perceived cost. And let me give you an example. So imagine that you have 2 donation appeal. You can describe them along 2 axes. On the x-axis, you have the cost. So as you go from the origin outward, the cost goes down. So it becomes more and more convenient for the donor to help. But on the y-axis, you have the benefit for the recipient. So as you go up, it becomes more and more beneficial for the recipients if I decide to help. And these 2 alternatives, donation appeal 1 and donation appeal 2, are basically, how can I say, could be both very attractive to the donors. In one case, they do a lot of good with the donation appeal 1. In the other case, they don't spend a lot of money, which is donation appeal 2. And since we know that the good feeling of helping is basically an on-off reaction, I feel good or don't feel good about giving, the donation appeal 2 could be quite attractive to people, because they can get the positive feeling of helping, but they don't spend a lot of money. What we can do is to add a new alternative which we technically call decoy alternative, which is dominated by donation appeal 1. In this case, we have an alternative that is equally expensive as donation appeal 1, so ask people to give more than donation appeal 2, but is not as beneficial. And this alternative that no one is going to choose because it's clearly inferior to donation appeal 1 and also to donation appeal 2, has a role because it is not just discarded as an irrelevant alternative, but is used to give a different meaning to the alternative that were present before, and makes donation appeal 1 look more beneficial, only because there is this kind of comparison, direct comparison with the decoy alternative. So in one study, we told people that their neighbor had the house that burned down, and they were asked to help to restock the house and help rebuilding it. And they could choose among 2 or 3 alternatives. Actually, okay, I have it here. One group of people saw only the target alternative and the competitor, and the second group saw all three alternatives. So, the target alternative was a 4.5 out of 5 star blanket plus pillow. So it was good quality blanket and a pillow which fits well with the blanket. The competitor down here, and this target option was $50. And the competitor down here, it was a 4 out of 5 star blanket, so not as good as the other one, and no pillow, so not as beneficial to the recipient as the target, but it was less expensive, it was only $30. And the decoy was the same quality of the blanket as the target, but no pillow, and it was the same amount of the required for the donation. So what we found, and of course we measured perceived benefit and perceived cost with the 2 questions for each dimension. For the benefit was how much you perceive your donation, the target as beneficial, or the competitor as beneficial for your neighbor. And the second question was how much you think you can make a difference for your neighbor. And the cost was how much you perceive the target or the competitor as a cost for you, and how much would you like to use the money for something else. So it's basically the opportunity cost. And the results show that the group that saw 3 alternatives was more likely to make a donation, to choose the target alternative, 67%, versus the group with 2 alternatives. So adding the decoy increases the number of people who choose the target, even though it should not make any difference, actually. And in this way, we basically replicated in the charitable giving domain the results that already have been found in consumer behavior. But the most interesting, for me at least, result is that, as you can see here, this is the benefit, the perception of benefit. And for the target in white, it goes up when there is 3 alternatives, so when the decoy is present compared to when the decoy is not present. And no different actually is found for the competitor. For the competitor, it actually goes down a little bit, but it's not a significant difference. So basically, when we added, and no difference was found for the cost of the target. So the cost of the target is the same with or without the decoy, but the benefit increases. And what does it mean? It means that when we add the decoy, the target is perceived in a more favorable way. The benefit is higher, the cost is the same, and so the difference between the 2 dimensions become larger. The benefit overweights the cost even more in the 3 alternative set than the 2 alternative one. So this is a rather simple way to increase the benefit of a donation appeal and to also lead donors to give a little bit more. It's very easy to do when you have fundraising campaigns that are on the web or with mail. You just have to prepare your material in a way that you have three alternatives. One of them is dominated, and you have to be very careful though where you put the dominated alternative. I will show you some backfiring effects in a second. And we replicated these results in several other studies. I'm not going to talk about all of them, but this last one, the fourth study, is probably the most interesting to us in this context, because we replicated the experiment with giving participants a chance to make no donation at all. So instead of telling them you decided to make a donation, choose among these one of these three alternatives, we told them to first decide whether they wanted to make a donation or not, and then which alternative they wanted to choose if they wanted to make a donation, which is a more realistic case, more ecological case. And also, in one condition in study 4, we added the chance to fill a text box with any amount of money people wanted to give if the three alternatives were not right to them. They thought they were not the right amount they wanted to give. And we replicated the attraction effect even in this case. So even in a more ecological setting, giving people the chance to not give at all or give any amount they felt suitable for that situation. And here is the backfiring risk. So sometimes if you put the decoy in a position that is dominated by the competitor, so in our case, the cheaper donation, you end up, this decoy, as you can see, is equally beneficial as the competitor, but it's more expensive, so it's dominated. It's not a very good option. But what you find is that in this case, the competitor looks even less costly to the donor and more people will choose it. So if you don't want to make mistake, you have to stay around the target and you have to be very aware of which alternative you want to push and to help being chosen more often by people. That doesn't mean that you don't want to, increase donation to the competitor. Sometimes it might be a good idea if this donation is low enough that you get a lot of people choosing it. But most of the times, I guess, it's better to work with the target with the most expensive alternative. And of course, these numbers are made up. Everybody has to then do field tests with their own programs, donations, and so on, and see what works better for them. So is a kind of a suggestion of what to do, but it's very important then to go in the field and do it and do the right test in the field. Okay, so the second example I want to present is about bundling. So basically, it's a way to split the donation in several sub alternatives or sub programs and make it more attractive to people. Let's say that we have an aid program that helps quite a bit of people, but to actually help them, I have to give a substantial amount of money. We saw before that this is going to decrease willingness to donate because people feel rather the same about helping few people or many people, but are a lot more sensitive to the amount of money. So one thing we can do is to divide this aid program into aid programs and ask people to fund them both at the same time. And this way we have two different programs that help less people, but also are associated to smaller amount of money, and people will have a more positive reaction toward the first one and a more positive reaction to the second one compared to the larger first one. And in this case, willingness to donate will go up. So, for example, in one study, we asked people to help children living in a refugee camp in a condition of extreme poverty and hunger. And in one condition, they had one single aid program, which was $150 donation to help 60 children. And in this case, as we saw in the first example I showed you with the 7 scenarios, what happens is that people here tends to overweight the cost compared to the benefit. They feel like the benefit is not high enough compared to the cost to really make it a worth donation, and they tend not to give. And in another condition, we split this donation appeal in 3 different smaller appeals, but we ask people to fully fund these 3 aid programs. So in the first one, they were helping 10 children with a $25 donation. In the second one, 20 children with a $50 donation. In the third one, 30 children with a $75 donation. But they had, if they choose to give, they had to give the overall amount. No, they couldn't choose one or the other of these 3. They had to fund all of them. And in this case, what we know from the literature is that people basically, even if they may, compute the overall amount of money they are asked and the overall amount of children they are helping, they actually have beforehand an intuitive reaction, which is, oh, I like the first donation appeal because it's not too expensive. It helps quite a number of children, looks good. And the second looks better than the $150 donation, and the third one as well. And so they basically average their intuitive reaction, their feelings toward each of these 3 programs. And in the end, they have a more favorable trade-off between cost and benefit compared to when we present the single amount of money and children. And the results support this conclusion. We found that the bundle, the 3 donation program, were led to 71% people giving, whereas the $150 90 children alternative led to only 46% people who decided to give. Interestingly, as you can see here, we also had 2 conditions with the overall, with the single amount or the bundle for a total of 165. And the bundle for 165 produced a higher amount of people who were willing to give compared to the single amount, $150. So with the bundle, you can even lead people to give more money than they would do with a single amount. And this happened because of this. When we measured cost and benefit, what you can see here is that the benefit is the same for both alternatives. So even if I give you the number of children as a single amount, or I divide it in different donation appeals, your reaction is, your perception of the benefit is the same. But when I split the cost, like here, so for the bundle, you perceive the cost, the donor perceive the cost as lower compared to the lump sum when I give them a single amount of money, a larger amount of money. And that's what makes the difference. So the trade-off is better, is more favorable when there is the bundle compared to when there is the lump sum. And more people are willing to give. So these were the 2 examples I wanted to show you. Let me just wrap up what we have seen so far. So the effect of cost and benefit is basically based on how people trade off their perception of these two dimensions, and is a very simple way but effective way to measure their reaction to a donation appeal and the way they are likely to react, whether they are willing to help or not. We found that this effect can be found also when people are allowed to choose freely how much money they want to give, even though the examples I showed you are all with fixed amounts of money, but even with open-ended questions about how much you want to give, it works. It works when we express the benefit in a qualitative way rather than quantitative. So not when we use the number of children, not when we use the stars to measure the quality of a blanket, but for example, when we present people with labels like cancer research, refugees, or it could be the name of a charity. If it's a famous charity, likely they would perceive the benefit as higher. If it's a charity that is renowned for being effective, they likely see the benefit as being higher. And the cost-benefit trade-off should be should work even with volunteering, so with time instead of money. Although I have to say that time is for a lot of people is less valuable and less easy to evaluate than money. So the effect is likely to be not as big with volunteering, with time as a resource than money. Since the benefit is perceived in a very intuitive way, all or nothing fashion, it's easy to increase it when we provide a reference point. So the decoy, for example, in the attraction effect ends up being helpful because makes easier to evaluate the benefit of the target compared to the competitor, and so make it being perceived as higher. And there are many other ways that can be tested, and we tested in the past, where you can increase benefit thanks to adding a reference point. And when you want to increase decrease, sorry, the perception of cost, what you can do is break them down in smaller amounts. And this way, when you break down in small amount the cost and the benefit is not as impacted because it's an almost all or nothing evaluation. So regardless of how large is the benefit, is always perceived as quite big, but the cost is more is a more precise evaluation, is more cognitive in a sense. And so breaking it down has a big impact on how people perceived it. So I hope this was interesting, of course, and I think it's an approach that is very easy to test in the field. You don't have to do much. You just have to create the right donation appeals, the right way to present the information, and then compare several treatments, several conditions, and see which one is the most effective. And you can do it basing your field studies on very sound and well-known psychological processes and economic processes and things we know about how people process information and uses information when they make decisions. And that's it.
Thank you, Enrico. We have time for a few questions before our break. Nick?
So we have a question here. Someone who is experimenting with bundling right now and this is for an artistic risk fund, and it worked very well for them. So their annual gift plus a gift for the artistic risk fund worked well. They're now trying an annual gift plus a gift for a parks fund project, and they wanted to know your thoughts on an annual gift plus a special gift for a different fund.
I think yeah, it should work better than having a single larger donation. The annual gift can be a way to reduce the cost. Could also be to move it away in time, so not just the bundle, but also telling people, you know, you can make a yearly donation. You commit now, but we will charge your credit card, for example, in a month or in 2 months from now. Of course, it depends how you are collecting the donations, and it would be more effective if the two donations in the bundle are kind of related to each other, so there is some connection. So they are not the same thing, but they are related. That for sure will make people feel like the cost is lower, but the benefit is maybe even larger because they are doing two good things for something they care about.
Yep. Combining a couple of questions, does the number of options and the order of the options to present them with the decoy matter?
Yeah, I would say that yes, there are. In our studies, we presented the three alternatives in random order. We didn't find a lot of impact of the order, but I would say that I would start with the target, then the decoy, and then the competitor. And I would, if I was going to do a test in the field, I would have the competitor and the target and the decoy one next to the other, because that maximizes the chances that people can compare them, and so make the target look good compared to the decoy.
Great, thank you. Can you speak a little bit more on study 5? Do you think the open-ended dollar amount created the worst results?
No, we didn't find a large impact of the open-ended question. It was hypothetical, so I would expect maybe a bit more of an impact in real world. But you know, it really depends on trialing these effects and finding the right donation amounts for your audience, your population, your donors, in a way that is an amount that is acceptable to them, is not too high, is not too low as well, because you know they don't want to give an irrelevant amount of money. I would think that if you have the decoy in the set, the open-ended question is going to be less influential, because there is one alternative that the target that looks clearly the best one, and so a lot of people would choose it, even if maybe it's not really the amount of money they want to give, but they would probably find it more interesting. If you have only two alternatives, the target and the competitor, I would think that since there might be some conflict between maximizing the benefit or maximizing the low amount, I would think that some people would choose the open-ended alternative only to escape from this conflict. Yeah.